Hello, everyone. Welcome to the show this week. Today, we are going to talk about accessibility, but more on the intersection with SEO and web performance. And my guest today is Weston Thayer. I welcome, Weston.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, nice to
Hey.
have you. So, Weston is the founder at Assistive Labs, and where I think the software or the work they do is mostly fully focused on accessibility. But before then, I think you worked at Microsoft and also at Zapier.
hmm
And yeah, maybe I leave it up to you to introduce yourself and talk a bit more about what you do.
Yeah, sure. So as you said, I work on Assistive Labs right now, which is a really small accessibility tooling startup. We kind of put assistive technologies in the cloud, is one way to think of it. So if you need to go test your website's compatibility with screen readers or screen magnifiers or different display modes, you can go to assistivelabs.com and really quickly through your browser access. If you're on a Mac, you can get to PCs running that software, or we have the ability to do that. Vice versa, kind of coming out. And our focus has been on trying to make really easy to use tools for companies, large companies, and also small teams who are trying to do web accessibility work, and just make it easier on them. Recently, we've done a lot of work into automation, so we have ways to automate screen readers and automate a lot of the manual work um, folks are doing as well. So yeah, it's been really cool to work on that. Um, and yeah, prior to that, worked at a startup called Zapier, which was not accessibility focused particularly at all, but definitely automation focused. Slowly has gotten better in terms of accessibility. We worked on it a bit there. And then when I was at Microsoft, I was working on the Windows design team. This was back when Windows Phone, it was the last breaths of the Windows Phone OS. So we did a really fun project trying to create a universal set of components that could work for phone and for PCs. So it was pens and touch and mouse and making all of those different input modalities accessible, have proper contrast. So that was a really good experience with the accessibility team there. And last, my history nugget is way back. I was working on Microsoft Word's testing team, and that was actually my first professional experience with accessibility testing. It was like a 40-person team, and they handed us a cardboard box copy of JAWS, the screen reader software, and there was one box with a license, I think CD inside.
Wow.
Um, and we did a test pass by like installing JAWS on our local machine and trying the latest Word features with it, and then handing it off to the next person, which was an interesting experience. We weren't provided any training to do that. I wasn't taught about it in college. So I'd say
That
some of my professional experiences come from that very early impression.
yeah, learning on the job.
Yeah, yeah. And, uh, you know,
But it's quite interesting, you went from engineer to designer and now founder. How has the journey been for you, going through this transition?
yeah, I've done a lot of different roles. I really enjoy just learning different disciplines. I wouldn't say I'm awesome at any of them. The classic jack of all trades uh, kind of stereotype I think applies to me. So that's really been my career. Is I've been curious in different areas, and I've gone out and learned about those areas, learned from all the wonderful people who share their skill set in those areas. Um, and what I'm doing now is a really kind of fun place to be, just because I get to switch between so many different skill sets. I'll be doing testing, or I'll be doing design work, or I'll be doing sales or software development. A little bit of everything.
Yeah, I'm just curious how what prompted the like founding a company because Zapier at Zapier you were not you were doing designs, not so much accessibility, I guess. So
Right. And actually, my role at Zapier is a good source of content for this conversation. I was the first product designer they hired for their growth team in the mid 2010s. There was a hot thing in startups where Silicon Valley was like, every startup should have a growth team, and growth teams are going to like growth hack and they'll make your numbers go way up. So Zapier started one of those, and it was a very small team focused on uh, SEO, different funnels you could set up to boost numbers, different campaigns you could try out, kind of creative ideas, throw things on the wall, see what stick. But that was a product design role where kind of worked across a lot of different properties at Zapier. And Zapier is kind of behind the curtains there. One of their huge marketing drivers is SEO. That was something they set up very early in the company. And there's some good blog posts that talk through their strategy there. But their one of their big marketing funnels is built on people searching. So for context, Zapier is this automation company that's mainly about integrations. Like, oh, I need to connect Gmail to Slack, or I want to make it so that when I send this Slack message, it should also mirror it into my CRM or something. So there's so many different CRMs, so many different email platforms. Zapier integrates with all those, and people will search those sort of exact things. Like, I need to get Gmail connected to Slack or something. And so Zapier built a gigantic landing page directory um, that has all those combinations inside there. So it's a very long tail of content, but because there's thousands and thousands of pages that all get a couple hundred visits per month, that adds up to a really big uh, set of unique visitors coming in through Google. So that's some context there of working on growth, and then to answer your question of switching over to accessibility, we'd gotten I'd been interested in accessibility from working at Microsoft and that early experience with Microsoft Word, and we'd pushed with some internal folks, lots of grassroots stuff at Zapier to do better, and had identified areas to work in. And I just got more and more interested in the space, and finally kind of sat down and was like, all right, I really want to wrap my head around this one particular area, which was accessibility trees and how screen readers work. And I got really interested in that. And as I was learning that stuff more fully, uh, stumbled upon this problem, which at that time there was no way, if you were on a Mac, to go test some of the most popular screen readers in the world, which are all PC based, without setting up a virtual machine on your Mac. And that seemed surprising to me. I was like, we have Browser Stack, we have these other solutions for web browsers. Why is there not just a really simple solution um,
interesting.
for Mac? So yeah, talked to people in the community from there of like, is this a real problem that you face? And yeah, just got inspired of like, I think I could build this. It started out as kind of a scratching an itch type thing. It was, can this tool get built? And then as it got built and people started using it, we realized, oh my gosh, there's really cool problems to work on this space. Um, and kind of the dream built from there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting journey. I think brings to mind, I think, one quote from YC, which is something like solve problem people want, or something along that line about solving those problems. I think that makes sense. And browser stack brings to mind. So it's more like taking this as accessibility testing tools and putting it on the cloud, which is quite uh, maybe not an easy work, because I don't know what goes on behind, trying to get all those tooling to be able to provision your service. But that's interesting. And also your journey about being more curious about, jack of all trades, and then later trying to go more into accessibility and figuring out that, oh, you want to do more around that. Makes me feel like this YouTube channel, or rather podcast as well, started around that, the similar premise, which was for me late last year, I was curious on like, okay, how does CDN works? How do all this, get websites faster? And then I started talking more about like CDNs and web performance, and then over time, looked at more people with their work around web performance. So I've had more web performance guests, and also now doing accessibility because I was just curious. So I don't know much about accessibility, but I know people don't talk much about it, and I'm curious how how it intersects with SEO and also web performance. And here we are, having three people, experts on the field, sharing their experience. So for me, it feels amazing.
Yeah, it's a great way to learn more about it. And I find that curiosity so fun of, well, how does this work? And then you can kind of, that's the beauty of the web platform. It's huge and there's so many different areas. It's impossible to be an expert at all the areas.
Yeah,
And, when you have a question like that of like, okay, I'm learning more about web performance, but how does accessibility work? You can pull on that thread and there's a whole nother world, inside there. Um, the learning journey never stops, which is, I find that fun.
yeah. I also learned about the accessibility tree from Leonie's talk when she described it, and I was like, oh, this more like the DOM, but on a different layer. And then last week she described how the DOM and the accessibility tree kind of interacts with each other, which was quite interesting to learn about. Because for me, I most places I've worked over my career, they rarely ever paid attention to accessibility, and maybe at the most it's more like later in my career, don't use div for buttons, and most people never fully focused on it. But I'm curious how that changes here in Europe because I think there's a law passed either in EU or in Germany only regarding providing these accessibility websites, and maybe people will start getting sued from next year for not having an accessible website.
Yeah, it's both. The European Accessibility Act is both an EU directive, but then the members implement it. So Germany does have its own unique law that kind of satisfies the requirements of it. So it's complicated. I'm not definitely not an expert on it, but there's so many different moving parts. Germany will have its own specific stuff. All the other countries. Um, so
It
it'll be
feels like web standard.
yeah, yeah.
Because I think also Leonie mentioned that with the accessibility, like each browsers, I think maybe just the accessibility tree, but they kind of implement something slightly different. And there's some recommendation from the W3C, but some browsers also have like peculiar implementations that are different. But I think that's the fun of working in the web. Works on IE or doesn't work on IE.
Yep. There's plenty of gray area in the W3C specifications.
Yeah. So let's you. I know you now. You work fully on accessibility, and you've also had experience with SEO. So I'm curious to hear your opinion or experience regarding how accessibility could improve SEO or vice versa.
Um, so I had no exposure to SEO until 2015 when I started working on it because at Microsoft, native apps, it just wasn't a factor. We had some interaction with the web platforms for design system components, but uh, I had never had exposure to that whole discipline in my career, and kind of took a crash course into it. And the experience I had was, I guess, in different stages. And I wonder if it's similar to how a lot of people go through their learning experience about SEO. I think the initial stage is this idea that there's some simple hacks you can do to game the system, and like, oh, if I do these things right, or if I do a link building campaign, I'll show up high in Google search results. And I think part of that is maybe that impression is has aged out by now, but it was more fresh in 2015, I think, because it was true in the 2000s. Googlebot was not that sophisticated, and people did find ways to game it. And there was a whole industry built around sort of the cat and mouse games of figuring out, okay, how do you get on top of Google search results? So that was kind of my first impression of like, well, it feels like I have to learn all these, nuances and these SEO expert tricks to be able to figure stuff out. And I think good things came from that, and bad things, like keyword stuffing, is probably one technique that folks have come across. A popular technique used to be to keyword stuff in image alt text, which is terrible for accessibility, right? But it did work at one point. Um, so there's kind of some conflict there. And then the second stage of learning was I found Moz, that SEO company.
Yeah.
Their founder Rand, I don't remember Rand's last name, but he did so many blog posts, and I found his voice in the space so helpful and refreshing, because the message I got from him was, look, all that stuff used to be true, and there's definitely a science to this. Like, you can measure the impacts of different techniques on SEO. But in the end, like, Google's goal is to go figure out like what is the most quality content in response to this keyword. And a keyword's like the terms that people type into the search box. And your job is to be the best result you can possibly be to that. And you kind of trust that Google will do a better and better job of sorting through content to find what people want. And I found that much more helpful to kind of build my mental models around of, okay, let's start with the users. Like, what is the best possible answer to somebody asking about this question, and how do I include that in my page and focus less on the hack stuff. There's definitely some structure stuff you need to do, and that's where I feel like it intersects much more nicely with accessibility. Take that alt text question again. If you're trying to create the best possible content for a page, like creating great image alts helps users who rely on those. And it's also a great signal to Google saying that, like, look, not only is there a blog post here with thoughtful content, but the images also seem very pertinent to it. And then Google can use those images and say, hey, we should feature these higher up in Google image search because we have a bit more confidence that they're related to somebody's image keywords. So that is a nice kind of dovetail.
Does it kind of read? I'm just curious how it kind of reads meaning into the author, because also it might be vulnerable to keyword stuffing, like you said, or does it kind of rely on like how long someone stays on the page? So if they navigate to the website, how long do they stay there before they move away? Probably.
Right, that's bounce rate. And yeah, all those add up to like all these signals that Google takes in and makes its determination. So take the keyword stuffing problem. Like, how did Googlebot overcome that? Modern Googlebot, old Googlebot used to get basically your HTML for the page and make its determination based off of that. And new Googlebot renders your page into a headless browser so it can actually take screenshots and use machine vision and everything else. So it can use machine vision to go look at your images and compare that against the alt text. And I'm sure they have
Wow.
their own algorithms to be like, this smells like keyword stuffing versus this seems like a really authentic description. And of course, all that's hidden away from the public. Google doesn't disclose how they actually do it. But that's where I've kind of landed, is like Google is getting very sophisticated. And in general, you can trust them to, if they are slightly vulnerable to it being gamed in a certain way right now, you can trust that they're going to fix that fairly soon. So it's not really worth, investing a ton in. Like, your best return on investment is how can I create quality content, and really create good answers to keywords.
Yeah. So
Um,
I guess like the focus should be on providing value rather than gaming or hacking the system.
Yes, and um, it's true up to an extent. So like take bounce rates, which is that time on page. That is a hugely important signal to Google, which makes a lot of sense. If you have a list of search results, somebody's searching for like best toaster, and if Google puts your page at number one and somebody clicks that and they leave 5 seconds later, that is a really good signal to Google that you're not getting what you need in that search result, especially if you go into the second search result and you spend 5 minutes. Um, Google doesn't know exactly why you did that, but seeing that in aggregate across millions or thousands of users, they kind of make the determination that like, hey, I think we should move result number 2 into slot number 1, based off of the time that people are spending on it.
Oh, interesting.
And where that's tricky is a huge part of SEO is, well, how do we reduce bounce rates? How do we keep more people on the page? And that the success of that goal is numbers based. It's volume. It's like if I get 1 million visitors in a month,
Hmm.
I am successful in bounce rate if I can keep the highest percentage on them on the page over a minute or something. And where that butts into accessibility is the numbers problem. It's like, okay, if only 0.5% of my users are relying on screen readers, they're not showing up very large in that metric. So if they bounce right away due to huge usability concerns, that's not going to show up in my metrics. And we don't know the answer of whether it shows up in Google's, but I think all kind of signals we see is that Google is not waiting that to create um, a fair balancing either. They're using kind of just total numbers of visitors as their metric. So in that sort of sense, like the scales are weighted towards the abled population, like what keeps them on the page longer. And I think a lot of the tensions between SEO and accessibility stem from that.
Mm. And from those metrics, you can't really tell where what kind of user is visiting, besides just maybe geography or and how what's the bounce rate. Except if you probably maybe interact more with your users to see what how they actually use the website and how they experience it.
Right. There's a tension between analytics and privacy with accessibility,
Yeah.
especially a tenet of the web platform. I think it's somewhere documented in W3C. Like a core principle is like not to disclose whether a user has a disability based on how they're interacting with the browser. Um, and browsers do a lot of work to mask that, to make sure that like it's not easy to determine in JavaScript exactly how someone's interacting with the page. Are they using keyboard? Are they using a screen reader? That said, it's not perfect. Like keyboard detection is definitely possible, and I think US Bank maybe. I could dig up a link. Someone did a project at one point of like, okay, I'm actually going to write analytics that look for keyboard usage, and then we're going to do product changes to improve keyboard accessibility, and then they could actually see their, usage metrics went up. That hypothesis that like, if you have an inaccessible website and you're wondering, well, do I need to make it accessible because I don't see any people coming to my website who rely on those features. I don't see disabled people. That is sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of, well, if your website doesn't work for people with disabilities, they're not going to visit your website. So there was some evidence of proving out that theory of like, yeah, they improved keyboard accessibility. More people showed up to use keyboard shortcuts in it. Um, so I believe in that theory. But again, these are smaller numbers. It's really minimized by the size of the traffic generated by um, users who are not relying on assistive technologies as much. I think it's a huge spectrum, right? Like so
Yeah.
many people use dark mode, so many people zoom in on their phones. Um, but at some point, the curve kind of uh, has an extreme right end versus extreme left end, and those areas are more in tension.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned something around the mega menu or the burger menu and how it affects how it's good for SEO but bad for accessibility.
Yeah, that's a really good tie into the bounce rates. So when I worked at Zapier, we ran experiments, and first to define mega menu for folks who may not be familiar with it. You usually find those on like Nordstrom.com or Macy's.com, a huge shopping retailer. The very top navigation bar of their website will be all the different departments. It'll be like you know shoes versus outerwear versus furniture, and then each of those menus has a gigantic drop down with all the different categorizations you could get out of that. Hugely popular in e-commerce. Um, and it's useful from a usability perspective. Like that's a information architecture that users can use to like go find what they need, and you can do usability studies on it. Um, but you can also design that menu optimizing for reducing bounce rates. Because a really good way to reduce bounce rates is to help people not just stay on the first page they landed on from Google. So in SEO, you want to make sure that someone clicks your Google search result, they land on your page. They could stay there for a while, but they don't have to if they click a link in your website and they keep going in. And as long as that keeps them from going back to Google for a while, you're doing really well by Google's standards. So with respect to designing mega menus for SEO, that technique that you see sometimes where if you hover your mouse over the mega menu, it immediately unfurls the whole thing. That has really big downsides. That actually fails a WCAG SC if not done correctly, but especially for like screen magnifier users, where you are really zoomed in on the screen and you are focusing different elements, and your mouse just happens to cross over that mega menu, and now your whole screen's been replaced by the content of the menu. And it's this really frustrating experience. You can't move your mouse away easily. But we did experiments, and that technique reduces bounce rates significantly. So if bounce rates are all you're optimizing for, it's this trade-off of like, well, we improved the bounce rate metric by this much by introducing this technique that we know is harmful for accessibility. Now you have a decision to make. It's like, which trade-off are we going to take there?
Mm. But is there like an alternative where you can have a better balance between being able to have this information architecture or design where you also keep them on the website to move around, but still beneficial to accessibility, even if it's maybe with a different design of the menu or a different way of presenting the information.
Yeah, and I think accessibility is really helpful in adding constraints around that. So if you take that specific thing of, you're laser focused on the mega menu, and you're only going to consider design changes to the mega menu that are going to replicate the bounce rate improvement you saw when you turned on automatic hover. If that is your narrow lens of focus, I think you'll be really hard pressed to like find a different thing you can do to the mega menu that satisfies both accessibility constraints and keeps that metric improvement that you got. But when you increase or you zoom out and look at the rest of the page, I think there's other opportunities where you could make up the same gains. Like maybe let's not focus on the mega menu. Let's focus more on the page content of this page. Um, so in that way, accessibility can kind of provide bounds or a constraint to it of like, look, we could do this. We could turn automatic hover, but we know it has negative impacts in terms of accessibility. So let's take that option off the table and let's look for accomplishing, improving bounce rate in different ways. Um, Another really good example of that is like have you heard the famous example of like Google testing I forget the number. It was like 42 different shades of blue for their button or something.
I don't think I've read about that. No.
It was part of the A/B testing craze that I feel like was big in the 2010s. I'm just gonna go real quick. A/B test shades of blue. Yeah, yeah. If you Google 41 shades of blue, you'll find it. But they popularized this A/B test that they did. They wanted to figure out what shade of blue generated the most clicks on a button. Um, 41 A/B tests, huge amount of users. Like they figured it out. Users click this shade of blue most. And I think they ended up on a shade of blue that has good color contrast. But if you take accessibility out of the equation there, you'd have a huge set of options to choose from, some of them with terrible color contrast that have known accessibility issues. Um, and the scary thing is you could land on one of those and see, oh, this actually is the absolute peak of clicks. So we should choose this inaccessible color, which I don't think is a very good trade-off. I think it's better to go into that experiment with knowledge of like, here's a set of colors we could go with. Let's run the experiment with that more limited set, and choose from a set of colors that we know works well for everyone, not just this um, majority rules
Yeah.
philosophy.
Do you think if for designers, since you were also a designer, do they know about this? Is it common knowledge with the color contrast and also considering colors that are not just appealing to people that have high visual ability, but across board? Do they care about those, or they just also go with instinct like blue is the better color? Or these days with tech dev companies, it's black and white all through and then dark background.
It's a huge variety, and I think overall the industry is making more progress in awareness. There's certainly better tools that fit into design software to alert people that, hey, these color combinations have contrast issues, and that can be their first exposure. Um, but I think it varies. It's like, did the designer learn about accessibility in design school? If they didn't, they may not be aware. Uh, is the organization where they're working aware of accessibility?
Yeah,
Um, it will all vary inside there. I think in the best, I'd love to see the world move towards accessibility being included in more design programs. And there's, I think, some really good efforts underway to make that happen. And as companies and organizations, you talk about the European Accessibility Act. That's one driver that can help enforce awareness. It's like, okay, I'm a new designer at this company. I've never been exposed to this before, but now it's the company's responsibility to kind of help you
yeah,
expand that area.
yeah. I'd be curious to see how that changes in EU because I think I'm not sure if it's from this year or next year to be fully enforced. So probably you will see a lot more people. I know I have a friend who works with a project for one of the maybe railways or so, and they had to focus a lot on accessibility before they go live. But I'd be curious how this affects non-governmental organizations as well.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
agreed. Um,
yeah,
I will say, like, one of the coolest things in the space is there's so much grassroots. Like, I think a ton of designers, a ton of developers want to learn more about accessibility because they believe in it. They believe it's the right thing to do, and people are self-educating. And I've seen so many examples where one designer is very interested in accessibility. They learn about it, and then they spread it to their team of like, hey, y'all, like, I learned about this. Let me help teach you about it, and let's have a conversation of why, if we don't want to change some of our designs, why? And then that conversation starts pushing up within a company. I think that's happening in so many places, which is wonderful.
yeah, I think that's nice to have. Probably also maybe like you said with the education, if accessibility gets taught in school, and I was just thinking through your conversation too that it could also be. partly from the education, also partly from what is common in the society. So I
Hmm.
come from I lived in Lagos my whole life, or most part of my life. I moved into Germany like 4 or 5 years ago, and I would say for me it's eye opening a few things I've experienced here because back there, if you when you say accessibility to me, it's more like being able to have easy access to a building or a person via some kind of hacks, and not about how we talk about it being equitable and all that, and the roads or the buildings and things are not designed with any of that in mind. So disabled people, I imagine, find it very hard to do things or move around. And I never thought of it like maybe this thing could be better, or it's just, oh, this is how things operate and this is how these people move around or how they use things, until I came to Europe. And then, like, maybe crossing the street light and I hear there's a beep sound, and I was wondering why it always made that noise, but then I realized, oh, it's for people that probably can't see, but they can tell that it turned green, or some signs on the train station or the road where you can know that, oh, you are getting close to the edge of the road. And those designs for me became quite interesting to realize that actually these things have been thought about. And you know maybe someday for you, probably you get injured and you need to access somewhere, this is really helpful. Then so your society also kind of brings those things to mind for you when you are making a building design, or making some other things for other people around you to use. So I think those things, what you learn from your society around you, also affect some of those decisions.
100%. Like maybe that's the most important foundation, and the never-ending journey that you know the all societies are on that journey. Um,
Yeah, I hope we get there back home in my country, because I don't really see the government putting much more effort into those kind of policies. And from what I see here, I imagine those people over there, have really hard time, you know, getting around. And yeah, but hopefully we get there in the near. Every country also passed through that phase, so hopefully we get there soon.
yeah, I
Yeah,
think I find trying to fit all the different like socioeconomic pressures and all the different environments in my head is so hard. I uh, am comforted, I guess, of whatever like situation that I happen to be working with. Just focusing on like, well, like what's one way we could improve it a little bit? Like, is there any practical options we could go for now? And just always kind of aiming for progress that's in the context of wherever we're at. Um,
yeah.
yeah, it's gonna vary.
Like to wrap up with a bit of a touch around web performance and accessibility, which I think, from your opinion, you said they are a bit at a conflict from your experience. So maybe you can talk about that with, maybe the example you mentioned with lazy loading and maybe a few others.
Sure. So to kind of preference, like I feel like I have a bone to pick with stuff at the higher levels of it. I think there's a really good foundation where they're in great agreement. The progressive enhancement strategy has awesome benefits to both performance and accessibility, and I think there's probably more in common than not in common between the two, which I feel less qualified to speak to. I feel like I've learned about it and then for some reason focused in on the areas where I've seen the tension. So uh, I guess I don't mean to over amplify them, but I'll share the areas where I have seen that tension. Maybe my biggest area that I've done research into in the past couple years is single page applications versus multi-page applications, which MPAs are just the web as it's always been. I'm not sure if it's a new term the web platform coined to refer to it, but SPAs, SPAs, single page applications are relatively new. And I don't know if they were invented entirely for performance, but I've seen a lot of stuff in it. Like Next.js is a really popular SPA framework, and one of the performance features they touted was they were one of the first, I think, to do link reloading. So if you visited a page, um, they would look at where your mouse is or try to look for signs of where you might go next, and they would actually request the resources for that page before you clicked to ask for it, so that when you did click, it was just a lightning fast client side
Yeah,
replacement of content. They had some really cool demos with that.
yeah. I think it was a mix of performance on the client side and also interaction, like how cool you can do all those interaction without going back to the server. So
Yeah, yeah.
maybe,
Um, so spas had this really kind of, because they were happening on the client, and they challenged that notion that, because I think before spas, the assumption was just if you want another page, the user has to click a link and the browser has to request it. There's nothing you can do about that. Like that can't be optimized.
you know,
With spas, because spas were handling history and routing themselves, that suddenly became something that could be optimized. Um, and that's just one example of ways you can squeeze performance out of spas, which is really cool. The catch to that, I think, and the tension is um, a lot of foundational things that you get for free from the browser in terms of accessibility with multi-page applications, like how things just traditionally work, weren't present in spas, because the web's platform's organic. The features for spas kind of evolved out of existing features, and the
you know,
community innovated on it. But to take an example, uh, probably the most popular example, on a multi-page website or traditional website, when you click a link, if you're using a screen reader, the browser automatically sends the screen reader events that say, okay, the page is loading. Here's the new page title. The page is finished loading. It's ready for interaction. So that's all context for the user. A screen reader user, that's super important to understanding, okay, I'm ready to interact with the page again. By default, spas didn't come with any of that. I think the default experience, it varies on application. The worst could be you'd click a link inside it and screen readers would say absolutely nothing. Um, so you just don't get any of that stuff out of the box.
and
And
maybe, sorry, maybe 30 seconds later, you just have all the data back and everything re-renders on the screen. And then you have the screen reader screaming, okay, something changed.
right, and it all depends on how it's implemented. You can definitely end up in scenarios where all that data comes back and the screen reader still doesn't say anything. So it's just total silence. Um, and all that was realized. People who are building spas started engineering all these techniques to try to improve that. So there's ways to make the screen reader say, "Hey, this page is ready." So like little patches or polyfills to try to make it better. Um, and that works to an extent. I think, eventually butt up in some scenarios against the fact that in JavaScript you don't have access to the same things the browser did, so you can't exactly replicate the way the browser would notify a screen reader. Um, so you kind of run into limitations around that, and the web platform works to respond to those. There's the navigation API is fairly new, and that was a great effort that sought to replace the old history API for page routing. Um, and if you really want to get nitty gritty with it, there's some issues in there that talk about the problems with the history API and why it was a problem for accessibility. But that's slowly rolling out. That's slowly getting released, and will result in better single page app experiences for those who opt into it. but it's very slow, right? And it's a trade-off you have to be cognizant of okay, if you're building a spa, you can do some things for accessibility that can almost bring it up to par in some cases with if you didn't do a spa. In some cases, the edges are much rougher. Um, I think that distinction is rarely thought about at the start. Um, Usually, the assumption is, hey, everybody's using spas. I'm sure it'll be fine. And if it's not, we can
Yeah.
get our way out of it. Um, a really nasty one is focus restoration. So scroll restoration has been fairly well written about in single page applications. So that's the idea of like you are reading a blog post in a spa, you click a link, you go to a new page, and then you click the browser's back button. If you're halfway down the blog post, you expect that to be your scroll position when you come back, right?
Yeah.
That doesn't work out of the box with spas, but it does for traditional applications. In the same sort of idea for focus, if you're navigating with keyboard and you've tabbed into a page's footer, you click a link or invoke it with keyboard and then navigate back, it would be really handy to have that preserved, right? So that you didn't have to tab from the top of the page again. um, and that works for multi-page apps. There's this thing called the back forward cache, where browsers basically, when you click a normal link, they in most cases will put the whole page on ice, and then they'll bring back that exact same state when you come back, which includes your focus. So you just get it for free. It's awesome. It's wonderful. But when it comes to single page applications, it is a very, very hard problem to really do focus restoration well. Because all of a sudden, you don't just need to know the Y scroll amount that you need to restore. You also need to know which element on this page, this DOM that I just threw away because I
Yeah.
rendered the page. I need to bring DOM back, and now I need to remember which DOM I was on. And now, how does it work if you were in like a summary details or like an expanded menu? Say you tabbed into a menu, it expanded. That wasn't initially expanded when the page rendered. Now, when you restore it, you need to like re-expand that menu. So it just turns into a really tough
Yeah.
problem that I don't I haven't done a recent audit of spas, but I think it's very rarely solved.
I think I mean, maybe not with spas, but with frameworks like Next.js or Remix that now, people are, I think the trend now is also moving more in favor of server side rendering. So I think they kind of have a way they've solved for that. At, at least with Remix, I think they have a way they kind of solve that. But maybe with the traditional React, for example, maybe it's still a big problem, or there's some hacks you can do to make that work.
Yeah, I haven't caught up with Remix in a while. At least for Next.js with SSR, the strategy is um, SSR is important for like, especially Google. If you want all your pages to get indexed, it's helpful for Google can overcome this now because they can render your app in a headless browser. But it's certainly easier for Google if Google
Yeah.
can say, "Hey, give me this URL," and you send back the rendered HTML. But once you so say that's the first route you hit, like slash about, that gets SSR'd. The HTML that you get sent to the browser also includes your spa. So when you click a link on that page, now you're into client-side rendering. Um, so you still have that focus restoration problem because you are still doing client-side routing
Yeah.
after that first interaction. So like to put in an example, if you go to Google, you tab down into the page, you invoke the link to your page, and then you go to that page is SSR'd and renders. If you click the back button there, focus restoration usually works because that's a multi-page transition. The browser
Mm.
restores Google from its cache. If you take that one more step and you say, okay, you go to Google, invoke the link, go to your page, invoke a link on your page, and then go back, usually that's broken because your page to a second page in your app was a single page app, client side navigation.
Yeah. I'm not sure how if it solved the Next.js And I'm not also sure for Remix. I know for Remix, scroll restoration, they do that. I think you just there's a component you import and they automatically do that for you, but not totally sure with Focus. But I'm guessing they are able to do it for you behind the scenes because maybe not with the latest Next.js, but I know for Remix it takes a different approach to like input control. So they are not you have the option of making them controlled components like React usually advocate, but you can have them all controlled components, and then when you submit forms, there's a way Remix can send the data back to you to the server like regular HTTP or JSON requests. So I'm guessing they could be able to do that for you since you are not controlling the form states. Yeah,
It'd be good to check into again. I do remember scroll restoration started getting built into more frameworks, and hey, the more built in, the better. And that's a really good example of kind of that trade off of
yeah.
how many folks when they started spas, uh, you know, when did Next.js come out? Like 5 years ago or something, realized that by opting into it, they weren't going to be getting scroll restoration. They would have to wait 4 years or whatever to get that feature. And it's great that it's here now. And I think it's interesting how many trade-offs there are like that are kind of hidden when you're. I think that's kind of the culture of the web development world is like spas were mainly designed around performance and some other benefits, and it's that makes it hard to uncover those hidden trade-offs.
Yeah, but some I think sometimes you also don't know you don't they don't tell you what the negative side of the trade-off is.
Yeah, yeah,
So we you just buy into the hype of like being fast, being interactive, and then probably 2, 3, 5 years down the line you realize that the web has all this magic and we are trying to figure out a workaround. I feel like personally, I use React a lot in the last 5 years, and I'm starting uh, to prefer not to use it for most cases because there's a lot of things you get from the web platform or from some traditional stuff that when you do those things in React, you are trying to find a workaround and you don't realize that you've moved uh, of the traditional part, like with web forms, for example, having to do control state and new states all over just to handle forms. And meanwhile, with the browser, you just render inputs and then you can handle them from URL encoded form data and all. So those are
yeah.
the things you unlearn.
No, I think that's totally on point. I mean, I feel called out because so AssistiveLabs.com is built with Next.js, and it was built 2019 is when it started, which is pretty close to when Next.js happened. And that is like exactly the stages I went through of like, wow, here's the hype. This seems really awesome. Started building with it, and got really far into it, past the point of like, oh, I'm gonna abandon this in favor of a different decision, and then started auditing our own site for accessibility and realized like, oh gosh, scroll restoration, oh gosh, focus restoration, oh gosh, routing. And I got very early exposure to those problems that Next.js started addressing as a platform, I think in like 2023 or four. But that's years later. So yeah, I definitely lived through that
Yeah, maybe
experience.
maybe maybe we'll see a comeback of everyone going back to NPH because now we went from SPA to SSR and all the whole lingo around partial hydration and all. Maybe we'll see next year is doing multi-page apps fully and not just SPAs. Who knows?
Yeah, we'll see. I've been having fun building uh, multi-page apps with. I haven't built anything at huge scale yet, but there's just so many cool web platform features that are here now that weren't
Yeah.
um, back then.
Which
There's
ones are
multi.
you excited about?
Um, let's see. I found multi-page transitions really cool. So if you do want to stitch together animations between when someone clicks a link, like I want to be much more like a single page app in terms of UX. And I don't want, the browser to just totally tear down the DOM and render a brand new one. I want to control transitions. That's now possible. Um, the fact that you can use components with uh, web components and the shadow DOM is just awesome. I love that. There's some built-in isolation, and I think that is finally getting better support for SSR. That
Mm,
like this year, because that's been the biggest thing with web components is if you wanted shadow DOM, you could not SSR the whole thing. Um,
mm. Yeah.
those two things are probably the biggest. Like that, the fact that you can like natively mark images for lazy loading, you can also mark different assets for preloading. Just seems like a really nice toolkit that for the stuff I'm building gets me pretty much all the stuff I was using out of Next.js.
Yeah, I was going to mention view transition as well because that's also something I think is cool. You get this out of the box with the browser, and then if you want to tweak it, there are some more options you can add to the CSS or also using JavaScript to maybe have unique page transition settings. So that's one for me as well. And
Yeah,
I liked speculation rules for me too as well because you can do pre-render for multi-page apps as well. So you can configure um, like a JSON document that describes what set of pages, what should happen, maybe based on hover or some kind of um, heuristics. I think there are three options there, and then you have to either preload or pre-render, and then I think with that you can get something similar to what you get with pre-rendering on the server side, and maybe before the user hits clicks on the mouse, all the page is already rendered, and then it looks instant to them. Combine that with view transition, it looks more like native apps as well.
that's awesome. That one was I was totally out of the loop on. That's great that they're getting parity in that.
Yeah,
And I guess a caveat is, I feel like in this conversation we're talking up the web platform in terms of like, oh, it's great, if you can be more closely aligned to that in your architecture in terms of accessibility, which I think is mostly true. But just the caveat that like there have definitely been new web platform features that uh, didn't have accessibility considered as well inside them, and that's sometimes they stick around in that state for a long time. Sometimes it's corrected fairly quickly, but yeah, it can happen. Can happen anywhere.
yeah,
Best defense is to kind of be aware of it from the start and probe and test and try to get a good idea of how things perform in that aspect.
yeah. Because I think also the pre-render from the speculations rules is like an evolution of the link pre-render that they used to have. So now they don't recommend that because of what the field data already shows about the performance or maybe also accessibility implications. So now they are moving to not recommending that. Probably they've not taken it away from the from each browser spec because of backward compatibility. But those are nice to have. Yeah.
Backwards compatibility, the hardest problem on the web.
Yeah. So we can wrap up, and I would have the final question of where can people find you, or maybe about Assistive Lab to learn more about what you do with accessibility and your view on the web.
Yeah, so assistivelabs.com is spelled assistive without the E, labs.com, and that's a great way to. We have an article section that has some cool content. Can definitely follow along with us there. I'm not the most active on social media these days. We have a 2-year-old. My social media usage tanked with first child
Okay.
in the family.
Uh,
Um, I don't
yeah,
know if you.
I think Andrew is more active on social media.
Quite.
Maybe not a lot, but yeah.
Yep. Yeah, you can find Andrew will use our handles on Assistive Labs, and Andrew talks about a lot of stuff we do. And then also a plug for this amazing Slack workspace that the Slack comps to the accessibility community. It's called Web-A11Y. Um, and let me actually check what happens when you put that into Google. Web-A11Y Slack.
Just a11yproject.com or
Um,
Slack. Let me see if I put Slack on it. Uh, so there's accessibility Slack community. I'm not sure that's the one anyway. It's on accessibility.github.io.
yeah, that's a link to it. Unfortunately, they had to take down the public sign up links because of how that happens with Slack communities, that they get kind of bombarded by spam. But you can reach out to me or uh,
Okay.
anybody. Nicholas on there is on there, and Leonie's on there, and we'll
Oh,
get you invites. There's over 10,000 people last I checked, but it is a wonderful community of people of all sorts of levels and accessibility. It's a really fun place to lurk, to learn more. I learn more from it. Um, so I always like to make people aware of that.
yeah, I will drop the link in the comment. And thanks again for having this chat and sharing your expertise.
Yeah,
And folks, thank you for listening to the live stream or the recording later. And see you in 2 weeks where we talk to Nicholas about accessibility as well to see what different opinion he has from Weston. And see you next time. Bye bye.
thanks, Peter.